Welcome to this deep dive, our 11th, dedicated to Simone de Beauvoir's groundbreaking work, The Second Sex, and its lasting impact on feminist thought.
It really is powerful stuff, isn't it? And digging into it feels like peeling back these layers of history and philosophy just to understand how we got here.
Absolutely. Today, we're zeroing in on a very specific part of the book,
Right.
Chapter 1 of the Myths section, that covers pages 192 to 255 in the material we're looking at.
Right. This is where Beauvoir really starts dismantling how woman has been historically constructed. She looks at, well, everything from ancient myths right through to legal codes.
Exactly. Her core argument here is that across different times, different societies, you see myths, history, social structures, they all consistently define woman as the other.
Always in relation to man. He's the same, the essential subject, the default
And
almost.
she's other. So our goal in this deep dive is really to unpack the key arguments and, the examples Beauvoir uses here.
Yeah, to see how this definition of woman as other was first established, and then how it just kept getting perpetuated, reinforced.
Okay, let's dive in, starting right at the very beginning. Primitive societies. Beauvoir makes a pretty strong case that even back then, biological and economic factors were setting the stage for male supremacy.
She draws this really crucial distinction. Man, she says, invented the tool, and that active invention of shaping the world outside his body.
That connects to activity, right, to having a project.
Exactly, activity project. Whereas woman, she argues, was primarily tied to her body through motherhood, linked directly to the species' destiny, just, continuing life itself.
But isn't trying to be more than just survival sort of fundamentally human? Beauvoir talks about humanity trying to escape that basic species destiny.
Right, valuing reasons for living, things like creation, exploration, art, valuing those over just propagating the species.
Okay, so how does that lead to male dominance?
Well, because man's activity with tools allowed him to project himself into the future, to actively shape things, to create value outside of just reproduction.
He's seen as prevailing over those basic life forces.
Precisely. And that's where he sets himself up as master. And that dynamic, according to Beauvoir, leads to the subjugation of both nature and woman because they're both seen as tied to that raw, kind of untamed life force.
So this is the bedrock then, the idea of the other. Man needs an other to define himself against.
And because woman is different biologically, different from man the same, she just gets slotted into that other category.
It wasn't initially sexual, you said.
Not purely, no, but as her role, tied to fertility, nature's cycles, became more significant in people's minds, she increasingly filled that other space.
Which leads, kind of paradoxically, to the worship of female gods.
Exactly. Fertility goddesses, Ishtar, Astarte, Gaia, Rhea, Cybele, Isis, all those figures you see in early art and archaeology, like from Susa or Crete.
And Beauvoir finds their duality significant.
Very. They're often queen of heaven, pure like a dove, right? But also empress of the underworld, linked to darkness, maybe a serpent, fickle, cruel, kind, dangerous.
Just like nature itself, in her view.
That's the parallel she draws. And this divine status, it sort of rubs off on earthly women. They get surrounded by taboos, seen as magical, maybe sorceresses.
You see priestesses, sometimes women involved in tribal government.
It looks like power, doesn't it? But here's Beauvoir's crucial point. Even with all this prestige, this mystique, woman's power is still defined by male consciousness.
How so?
Well, these idols, these goddesses, man created them. He needed them, maybe feared them, but he is the one who posits them. He can ultimately destroy them too.
So even when worshipped, she's still framed by his perspective. It's his definition.
Yes. Man remains the master, just like he sees himself as master of the fertile earth he works. Woman, like nature, is ultimately destined to be subordinated, possessed, exploited. Any prestige comes from men.
And that perspective leads us, inevitably it seems, towards patriarchy and the concept of property. Beauvoir sees societies tending that way as man gets a clearer sense of himself, asserts his will.
A key driver, she points out, is the family unit. For a woman with children to form a really autonomous group, she needs a husband's presence. The old clan ties, the protection of a brother, weren't quite enough for this newer social structure.
Right, which is where you start seeing practices like buying a wife or exchanging goods. It's about ownership, transfer of responsibility.
Exactly. Husbands take direct responsibility for wives, for children. Sometimes there's even this weird economic exchange with the wife's brothers, a mix of old mystical duties and new economic realities.
And the father-son link becomes central.
Very central. Men affirming their connection to their sons more than nephews really cements that patrilineal lineal line and their own identity as fathers.
And Beauvoir keeps coming back to this point. Even if man fears woman's magic, he never gives up his fundamental power position.
Never. He posits her as essential, sure, maybe even terrifyingly essential, but he is the one doing the positing. In defining her, he confirms his own essential nature.
It's a strange loop. She's essential for him, but he decides that.
Right. So, despite her connection to life, to fertility, he remains the master. She's destined, like nature, to be possessed and exploited. Her prestige is granted.
And the real-world consequences of seeing woman as property.
Mm-hmm.
They're pretty brutal when you look at rights, chastity, law. Beauvoir gives stark examples.
Yeah, female infanticide among Arabs, just girls thrown into dishes. It was an act of generosity, of grace, for a father to even accept a daughter.
You see it reflected in religious texts, too, like Leviticus demanding longer cleansing for a mother after having a girl.
Mm-hmm. Or in blood money societies, where a woman's life was valued less, sometimes like a slave compared to a free man. It's stark.
And the father's power over a daughter was just total. Handed over completely to the husband at marriage.
Polygamy was common, limited really only by economics, and a husband could just disown his wives. It's a stark contrast to maybe earlier freedoms.
Because under patriarchy, rigorous chastity becomes absolutely essential.
Huge emphasis on demanding virgins, total fidelity from wives, severe penalties for adultery.
And the root cause, Beauvoir argues, is property. Simple as that.
Pretty much. Ensuring only your offspring inherit your stuff. Avoiding any foreign blood getting rights. A Roman paterfamilias could legally kill an adulterous wife. It was like high treason against the family property system.
And laws reflected this for centuries. The Napoleonic Code being famously lenient towards husbands avenging adultery.
Right. There might have been brief moments, overlaps between systems, where women had a bit more say.
But patriarchy clamped down. Woman became firmly the father's property to dispose of in marriage.
And moving through history, Beauvoir just piles up examples of this confinement, this scorn. Ancient Greece, we think of democracy, philosophy.
But for women, semi-slavery, basically. No freedom to even complain. Aspasia, Sappho, they're the outliers.
Even in Homer, reflecting an older time, women might have some influence, but ultimately a warrior could just dismiss them, send them to their chambers.
And the explicit contempt from thinkers is, wow. Hesiod saying confiding in a woman is like confiding in a thief.
Or Pericles.
Yeah.
The best woman is she of whom men speak the least. Just silence her.
Plato seems like a rare exception, right? Suggesting education for girls, councils of matrons.
He does, but Beauvoir points out how Aristophanes just mocked him for it. Remember Lysistrata? A character basically tells a woman trying to talk politics to shut up and go weave.
So Plato is going against the grain. Aristotle just reflected the common view.
Absolutely. Woman as deficient, weak, needs to obey, stay home.
Yeah.
Xenophon's dialogue shows a husband and wife almost as strangers. Her job is just run the house, be busy like a bee.
And the poets weren't much better. Archilochus Simonides calling women the greatest evil.
Hipponax saying the only two good days with a wife are the wedding and the funeral. It's brutal.
The complaints themselves, lazy, shrewish, spendthrift, they're just the flip side of the expected virtues, aren't they? Docility, quietness, thrift.
Exactly. And even dowries, meant to help the husband, led to complaints about arrogance. Menander. Greatest monster is still woman, a pain that never goes away. It's relentless.
And this long, long history runs right into a moment that seemed like it could change everything. The French Revolution.
A brief, intense flash of hope. Olympe de Gouges' Declaration of the Rights of Woman demanding the end of male privileges. A landmark document.
Others had similar ideas. Condorcet supported them.
But Beauvoir calls it abortive. De Gouges herself ended up executed. Women's political clubs, taken over by men or just shut down.
And the backlash was explicit. That quote from Chaumette banning women from public life.
Since when are women allowed to renounce their sex and become men? Be a woman, childcare, household tasks, those are your tasks. Just brutal. Banned from councils, banned from clubs.
So the actual gains were tiny. Succession rights changed, divorce became possible.
Feeble conquests, Beauvoir calls them, and she asks why it failed so badly.
Her analysis points to class, right? Bourgeois women, too, tied into the family structure, like parasites almost, to build real solidarity.
Exactly. Their class interests prevented collective action as women. Meanwhile, working-class women who did organize were condemned not just for their activism, but because they were women daring to step out of place.
Which brings us to the economic exploitation when women entered factories.
A really grim picture. They became this new pool of incredibly cheap labor, easily exploited.
Beauvoir quotes Marx from Das Kapital here, doesn't she?
Yes, that footnote where Marx observes manufacturers preferring married women with families. Why? Because they were more docile, more attentive, and crucially...
They'd worked themselves to exhaustion just to survive, to feed their kids.
Right. And Marx points out, Beauvoir highlights this, that the very qualities proper to women, like diligence, were twisted and used against her to enslave her in the factory.
Deville's summary is stark. Beast of luxury or beast of burden.
That was the reality for many. Conditions were so bad that some reformers, like Sismondi and Blanqui, actually argued for banning women from workshops.
Not to protect them, necessarily.
Well, partly maybe, but also because women initially lacked the means to organize effectively, to form unions and defend themselves. Those kinds of feminine associations only really started around 1848 Beauvoir nights.
This whole history creates some really weird paradoxes around women's legal status versus their social lives.
Yeah, for ages, a married woman had social standing but virtually no legal rights. A single woman had legal capacity but was often excluded socially.
And weird inconsistencies followed, like free love wasn't illegal, but adultery was a crime.
Or a fallen single girl was ruined, but a married woman's affairs might be treated more indulgently. Beauvoir even says some girls saw marriage as a way to have lovers more freely.
She calls the whole thing an ingenious system to keep women under guardianship.
Basically, yes. It made it incredibly hard for a woman's individual personality to really assert itself, except in very specific exceptional cases.
And she points to figures like Queen Isabella, Elizabeth, Catherine the Great, or saints like Catherine of Siena, Teresa of Avila, Joan of Arc.
Women who achieved extraordinary things comparable to men. But Beauvoir applies her lens again. In these roles, their femininity was almost socially canceled out.
They weren't seen as female rulers, just rulers.
Exactly. They transcended the category, and she makes that intriguing point. There were far more great queens than great kings, proportionally maybe, suggesting that when the gender constraints were lifted by the social role,
Potential wasn't limited. Otherwise, women's influence was indirect, often negative plots, intrigue, fighting with men, not leading armies.
right. Beauvoir thinks men often exaggerated that behind-the-scenes female influence to placate women, to convince them they had power so they wouldn't seek the real thing.
The real reins of the world, she says, were never in women's hands.
Never. Okay, so shifting from history and law, let's look at the overarching myth of woman itself. Beauvoir starts with Eve.
Right, the fact she's made from Adam's rib. Not autonomous, made for him.
Her spouse is her origin and her purpose. She's a complement, but, crucially, in the inessential mode, not the main event.
She's seen as privileged prey, nature, but conscious, transparent, submissive.
And man hopes to complete himself by possessing her, carnally. Her docile freedom confirms his freedom.
That line is striking. No man wants to be a woman, but all want women to exist. Thank God for creating woman.
It captures it perfectly. Man's existence is just a fact, all right? Woman's is a fortunate accident, a gift to him.
And as the other, she also becomes this symbol of plenitude of being.
Yeah, against his own feeling of lack, of nothingness, of existence. She embodies what he feels he's missing. He hopes to find himself, complete himself, through her.
But this dynamic breeds intense jealousy. Women confined, hidden, veiled.
Because her desire, if directed elsewhere, is a failure of his possession. And Beauvoir notes women often become accomplices in this, finding agency only through lies, secrecy, adultery.
Which explains why male jealousy is so easily provoked, so suspicious. Think Desdemona, Geneviève de Bourbon, suspected without cause.
The burden of proof is always on her. She has to prove innocence. And the jealousy is insatiable because, as Beauvoir says, you can't truly possess another consciousness.
Like trying to own the water from a spring.
Exactly. You benefit, but you don't own it. And this leads to the trope of woman as inconstant, fluid, deceitful. Think 1001 Nights, the Decameron full of clever women tricking men.
Society holds men responsible for women's chastity, for property, for religious reasons, authenticating paternity.
But then it layers on this contradictory demand.
Mm.
Man wants her to be his possession, predictable, but also foreign, mysterious, a servant, and a sorceress.
Which forces women into duplicity, she argues.
Right. He publicly wants the dutiful servant, but secretly desires the bad woman, the rebel nature, the sorceress. He indulges that desire in private, maybe, but condemns it publicly.
This shameful connivance with the bad invites sin at night, rejects the sinner in daylight.
While men's lives are secular, woman's sphere gets loaded with all these religious, magical qualities. And this whole process, Beauvoir says, is driven by the spirit of seriousness.
Replacing lived reality with a static idea, an idol.
Yes. The myth of woman replaces a real relationship with an autonomous person with just, staring at this mirage created by male needs and fears.
She quotes Laforgue. Mirage. Mirage. Kill them since we cannot seize them. Man loses by trapping woman in this symbol.
Collective dreams, cliches, they're so poor compared to actual living reality. And she makes that interesting point again. Women were maybe most truly cherished when seen as peers, like in the 18th century, not when trapped in the rigid myths of feudalism or the sentimental ones of the 19th century.
And this whole societal weight, this mystification, it hits hardest during adolescence. Beauvoir calls it a crucial, painful turning point.
It really is. Childhood games might steer girls towards passivity, but Beauvoir insists a girl is human first. She has that innate drive for activity, subjectivity, just like boys.
And she senses, deep down, that accepting womanhood, as defined by society, feels like a loss, a mutilation.
A resignation, yeah. Giving up that fundamental claim to be a subject. Childhood freedom feels safe, but the mother's world can feel stifling. Breaking away from that intimate maternal authority is a big struggle.
Beauvoir mentions different dynamics, from controlling mothers to the more typical rebellion Colette Audrey wrote about.
And then the body changes. Menstruation, this unavoidable sign of biological destiny. Eroticism shifts, becomes diffuse. The whole body is involved through touch, play, dancing.
Yeah, she also mentions the potential for regrettable incidents, those hushed-up encounters with trusted adults.
Yeah, leaving the girl isolated with fear and confusion. This feeds into fantasies and fears, especially around rape, checking rooms, fearing intruders. Beauvoir connects this to a deep-seated terror of violation.
Even disgust for the father can develop his smell, his physical presence.
And that recurring dream she mentions from psychoanalysis, being raped with an older woman's consent. Beauvoir sees it as the girl symbolically wrestling with her own desires and society's pressure, seeking permission to yield.
The demand for hypocrisy must be crushing, be pure, innocent, ignorant.
While internally dealing with all these new, confusing, sometimes abominable feelings and images, trying to hide it, conform, it creates this inner turmoil, these inhibitions.
Feeling burdened by unspeakable faults. Transforming into a woman becomes wrapped in shame. That awkward age is painted as real distress.
And a key source of this distress, Beauvoir stresses, is her lack of physical power. It's a profound frustration.
Not being able to physically impose your will on the world.
Exactly. She compares it to oppressed groups unable to use force. Your reality is defined for you. You can be made an object. Your subjective will has no concrete outlet through action.
Unlike the adolescent boy, who society permits to be forceful, to question, to revolt.
Right. He can actively choose to engage with the world. The girl is expected to submit. The world feels fixed, defined without her input.
And this physical powerlessness translates into a general timidity.
Yes, a lack of confidence in her own agency. Hesitation to be enterprising, inventive. She's conditioned for docility, resignation. Accepting physical weakness saps the courage for bigger undertakings, even intellectual ones. The tomboy example highlights this. Believing she was strong kept her spirit alive.
So adolescence is this huge conflict zone.
Absolutely. The clash between her inherent human claim to be a subject, active, free, and the erotic pull plus social pressure to accept herself as a passive object.
The core dilemma. How does she choose to become inessential when she feels essential? How renounce self to become other?
It's agonizing, wavering, uncertain, suspended between childhood independence and feminine submission. That's the bitter taste of unripe fruit.
How do girls react? Beauvoir outlines a few paths. Narcissism is a big one.
Which, counterintuitively, she links to masochism.
Explain that again. How does narcissism lead to masochism?
For the superior girl, Beauvoir argues, the thrill is constituting the self for and by another. By captivating a master, she feels enveloped by his qualities. Annihilating herself as an object for his gaze becomes this perverse assertion of being but a being totally defined by him.
Like Maria Bashkirtsev needing a superb enough man to lose herself in.
Exactly. And many girls chase this dream. The older, smarter, richer, famous man. The absolute subject whose love will confer value onto her. That quote is telling. I would like giants, and all I find is men.
So they disdain ordinary guys, avoid actual sexuality.
Often, yes. They prefer the fantasy image, the devoted victim, over confronting their own potential assertive self. They might be drawn to unavailable men.
But pull back if the man shows real interest, because he becomes ordinary.
Precisely. He's just a man. She feels disgraced by his ordinary desire and rejects him. If she does give in, the fantasy can shatter. She sees him as a brutal animal. Beauvoir even mentions suicides after such encounters.
This taste for the impossible, falling for married men, Don Juans.
It can lead to an inability to form real, complete love, always chasing the ideal. And freedom often gets expressed negatively, rejection, rebellion.
But there's a positive alternative, openness leading to receptivity.
Yes, a genuine, generous receptivity. Being devoted, attentive, understanding, but not losing oneself.
Like Rosamund Lehman's heroines, Olivia and Judy. They listen, they feel, they give love as a gift, but maintain their own lives, their own projects.
It's an attitude of expectation, tender docility, seeing value in the other, not just using the other. They charm by yielding, shaping themselves, embodying patience, sweetness. It's framed as a chosen openness, not just passivity.
And that lovely description of getting ready for a party, the dress transforming her, feeling capable, ready, it captures that link between appearance and inner feeling.
Moving on, she touches briefly on early sexual experiences for some girls trying to escape anxiety, maybe?
But calls them pseudo-experiences, theoretical, without real feeling.
Right. Superficial arousal, little pleasure. They might be deflowered virgins, still emotionally young, potentially leading to frigidity later if genuine pleasure isn't experienced.
And the feeling of being an object persists. Education reinforces it. Puberty confirms the body as passive, desirable.
Even in solitary pleasure, that split can happen, the imagined male subject, the female object being observed.
Society reinforces this through fashion, making women erotic objects, sometimes hindering practical action. Dressing up starts as a game, might become rebellion, but often settles into accepting the vocation as sex object.
Adorning oneself feels like expressing one's essence, like nature. But this objectification continues into middle age.
Where freedom arrives when it's too late. Colette's character.
Exactly. Patriarchy makes feminine roles servile. You escape that slavery when you're no longer productive in those roles. Men peak at 50, women are often forced into retirement. Taught devotion, now no one needs it. Feeling useless, no one needs me. Despair.
Religion is another major theme here, especially for women confined to immanence.
Beauvoir sees it offered as a mirage of transcendence. It serves male power by endorsing his codes, giving him authority.
Fear of God suppresses revolt. Women's credulity is assumed. They adopt faith in the masculine order, God as the ultimate authority figure.
In modern times, it's less overt constraint, more mystification. Offering equality through God in the next life, making earthly inequality seem unimportant, dedicating one's imminent life to God.
Why are girls often more fervent?
Beauvoir suggests God's gaze humbles a boy but saves the girl, cancels the male privilege, lets her avoid inferiority by being God's creature beyond earthly gender.
Though she does acknowledge the strength of female saints. Bridget, Catherine, Joan, Teresa.
Absolutely. Their virile steadfastness. They acted independently, took direction from God, not men. Catherine directed her confessors. Joan followed her voices.
But the institution, the church, ultimately ensures God doesn't authorize escape from male guardianship on earth.
That's Beauvoir's conclusion. Which brings us to love and abandonment, putting yourself entirely in another's hands.
A generous mistake that leads to disaster if abandoned.
A crushing catastrophe. Losing your whole identity if your life was totally centered on him. Difficult, maybe impossible to rebuild. Delirium, slow death.
That image of the woman at 40, face hardened, unable to love or be loved again, asking, what can I do if Jacques no longer loves me? Devastating.
A younger woman might heal, find new love, but maybe more cautiously. Or be crushed even harder, needing to redeem the past failure.
But failure in love can be productive
If the woman takes herself in hand, like Heloise running her abbey, or Colette's heroines saved by pride, work, inner resources. Cito knew Colette was much more than a woman in love.
So authentic love requires
Reciprocal recognition of two freedoms. not trying to complete each other, which implies a lack. Marriage should combine two autonomous people integrated into society.
Like Nora realizing she has to be a person first.
Exactly. The couple shouldn't be a closed-off unit. Individuals need connection to the wider world. A balanced couple isn't utopia. Beauvoir insists it can exist.
Finally, she looks at exceptional women. Artists, writers, actresses, dancers, singers first.
Their careers reinforce femininity, but give independence. They earn money, find meaning, escape the male yoke through work. Success adds to their sexual value, no conflict there.
The job justifies the focus on appearance, charm, satisfying to exhibit oneself, using artifice as a substitute for direct action. But a great actress becomes a creator.
Though there are traps, making life itself an artifice. Bernhardt versus Doucet, seeking only fame, not enriching the world.
And women writers, insurgents, like George Eliot.
Indicting injustice, yes. But Beauvoir, citing Woolf, argues they spent so much energy just fighting for the right to write, fighting constraints.
That they arrived out of breath where male writers began, lacking that effortless confidence or breadth of experience.
That's the argument. Modern women assert themselves more, but are still confined. Lucidity is a victory, but maybe they stop there.
Traditional women were mystified and instruments of mystification. Denouncing that is liberating. Cynicism as a defense may be a first step towards responsibility.
But sometimes, Beauvoir feels, women writers remain too tied to the cause, lacking the disinterested perspective for deeper exploration. They expose the mirages, but stop at the complex reality beneath.
Truth is ambiguous, mysterious, needs active recreation.
And women's autobiographies, while sincere, maybe don't delve as deep as Rousseau's Confessions, still too focused on achieving their own clarity.
Wow. Okay, so this deep dive into just that first chapter of Myths, it really lays bare how Beauvoir traces the historical, societal construction of woman as other.
It's meticulous, from primitive societies valuing tools over birth, through the complex worship of goddesses, to patriarchy locking things down via property.
You see how laws, philosophy, foundational myths like Eve, they all weave together this narrative of woman as complement, possession, object, defined by man, even when seemingly powerful.
Absolutely. And that depiction of adolescence, the physical changes, the social pressure, that core conflict between wanting to be a subject and being pushed into being an object, it's incredibly vivid.
And relatable, I imagine, for many even today. It feels very psychologically astute.
It is. She's not just mapping history, she's showing the internal cost. How these external definitions shape inner lives, fears, desires, relationships, self-worth.
And the exceptions, queens, saints, artists, they often prove the rule, in her view. They succeeded by having their femininity socially erased or by focusing on the fight itself.
Right, and this isn't just ancient history for Beauvoir. She's arguing these deep-seated ideas about women as other absolutely continue to shape our world, our expectations, our limitations, maybe just in different guises.
It definitely leaves you thinking, doesn't it? What specific myths about women, maybe less overt than the ones Beauvoir describes from the past, are still operating right now, shaping how we see ourselves and each other in society today?
That is a really potent question to carry away from this section.